8 hours before she was scheduled to appear in a secure room beneath the Capitol, Representative Ilhan Omar sat alone in her Longworth House office building suite, turning a single-page document over in her hands like it might reveal something new if she stared at it long enough. The subpoena had arrived the day before by courier, stiff paper, precise language, and a tone that offered no warmth or explanation. It instructed her to testify before the House Permanent Select Committee on intelligence in a classified session, citing only national security matter and nothing more. No outline of topics, no hint of concern, no courtesy call from staff to soften the edges. Just a time, a place, and the quiet implication that this was not a conversation she controlled. Her chief of staff, Ahmed Hassan, hovered nearby with the practiced calm of someone who had spent years watching Washington turn small details into existential threats. He had already made the calls, reached out to the committee offices, tried to extract context from staffers who knew how to say nothing while sounding polite. "They won't say what it's about," he told her, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. "They say it's classified, that you'll be briefed when you arrive." That last sentence hung in the air longer than either of them wanted. Omar waved a hand dismissively, the gesture automatic, almost rehearsed. "This is just another version of the same thing," she said, even as a flicker of unease crossed her face. "They've been investigating me for years and never found anything." She listed them like old headlines: marriage rumors, campaign finance complaints, foreign loyalty questions that seem to reappear on cue. Every time it turns into noise, and then it fades. Ahmed didn't look convinced, and he didn't try to hide it. "This one's different," he said, choosing his words carefully. "They're saying it's a skiff session, and they're saying no staff, no phones, no lawyers, unless they're cleared." That wasn't unusual, but it wasn't nothing either. It suggested gravity, process, and people who believed they were holding something serious. Omar reminded him, and perhaps herself, that she had sat in skiffs before. Foreign affairs briefings, intelligence updates, closed-door sessions that felt dramatic from the outside and bureaucratic once the door shut. She had navigated those rooms with confidence, even when the topics were grim. "This is how they operate," she said. "Secrecy to intimidate, silence to suggest danger where there is none." There was, of course, a reason she felt insulated. For years, every high-profile attack had seemed to strengthen her position rather than weaken it. When Donald Trump told her to go back to where she came from, her fundraising surged and her national profile exploded. When critics accused her of anti-Semitism over comments about Israel, she reframed the debate and forced a reckoning about speech and power. When conservative media fixated on her background, she leaned into it, calling out what she described as thinly veiled prejudice. The pattern was hard to ignore, and in Washington, patterns become lessons. Omar had learned that victimhood, when articulated skillfully, could be a form of armor. Call the attack racist, call it Islamophobic, call it a distraction, and much of the media ecosystem would fall into line. Progressive activists would mobilize, donors would rally, and critics would find themselves on the defensive. It had worked often enough to feel reliable. By the time she left her office that morning, she had convinced herself that this would be no different. Uncomfortable, perhaps, but manageable. Another closed-door attempt to rattle her. Another chance to emerge and frame the narrative. She had done it before, and she believed she could do it again. What she did not know, and could not confirm, was what assumptions the other side was bringing into that room. Elsewhere, miles away, a very different mood prevailed. In a secure facility in Virginia, Dan Bongino sat at a lawn. He was no stranger to controversy himself, a former law enforcement officer turned media figure turned senior official. Supporters saw him as relentless and unflinching. Critics saw him as partisan and combative. But inside that room, he was playing a different role, one that demanded restraint rather than rhetoric. Around him were analysts and agents who had spent their careers in the quiet corners of government, where certainty is rare and ambiguity is the rule. They spoke in conditional language, cited sources carefully, and argued over interpretations rather than conclusions. No one in that room talked about guilt as a settled matter. They talked about patterns, anomalies, correlations that raised questions difficult to ignore. The entire exercise was framed as evaluation, not judgment. If there was tension, it came from the stakes rather than the personalities. A sitting member of Congress, regardless of party, sits at a sensitive intersection of trust and access. The mere suggestion of compromised judgment or questionable contacts creates ripples far beyond the individual. Everyone in the room understood that perception alone could do damage. That awareness shaped every word they chose. Back in Washington, Omar's car pulled up to the Capitol just before the scheduled time. She passed through security with the familiarity of someone who had done so thousands of times. The deeper she went into the building, the fewer people there were. The quieter the corridors became. By the time she reached the secure area, the atmosphere had shifted from institutional bustle to something closer to isolation. Heavy doors, armed guards, and muted lighting tend to do that. Her chief of staff stopped at the final checkpoint, unable to go further. He offered to stay nearby, to make calls, to do anything that might help. She smiled, thanked him, and told him not to worry. "It's just politics," she said, the phrase sounding less certain than she intended. Then the door closed behind her with a dull, unmistakable thud. The room itself was unremarkable in design, which is often the point. No windows, neutral walls, a long table surrounded by people whose expressions were carefully controlled. At one end sat committee members from both parties, some familiar faces, others less so. At the other end sat Bongino, flanked by thick binders marked with classification labels she had seen before but never quite like this. For the first time that day, a chill crept in. The session began with formalities, the kind that sound redundant until you realize they are meant to remind everyone of consequences. Classification levels were stated, recording rules clarified, penalties for disclosure outlined in precise legal language. No one raised their voice, and no one needed to. The seriousness was baked into the procedure. It was not a show. When Bongino began to speak, his tone was measured, almost clinical. He did not accuse, at least not directly. He described an investigation as an inquiry, not a conclusion. He emphasized authorization, oversight, and legal thresholds. Again and again, he framed everything as a matter of process. Omar listened, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She had been in hearings before where she felt attacked, and this felt different. There was no grandstanding, no attempt to provoke an outburst. Instead, there was an almost unnerving calm, the kind that suggests confidence without needing to display it. What followed unfolded slowly, deliberately, like someone laying out pieces on a table and asking the viewer to notice how they fit. References to communications were described as reported, intercepted, or flagged, never asserted as definitive proof of intent. Financial records were presented as transactions of interest, not bribes. Meetings were framed as undisclosed contacts, not secret conspiracies. Every step was hedged, legally cautious, yet heavy with implication. At several points, Omar attempted to respond, only to be told she would have time later. The restraint was frustrating, perhaps intentionally so. It denied her the chance to seize the narrative in real time. Instead, she was forced to listen as others narrated a version of events she did not recognize as her own. Or perhaps recognized too well. The most unsettling moments were not the documents or the charts, but the questions. Why did certain media reports appear so soon after classified briefings? Why did travel disclosures omit meetings later corroborated by photographs? Why did financial transfers cluster around specific time frames? Why did conversations, if taken at face value, seem to express hostility toward U.S. policy while privately conveying something else? None of these were framed as accusations, but together they formed a mosaic that was hard to dismiss. At one point, a committee member asked whether alternative explanations had been considered. Could others have leaked information? Could remarks have been misinterpreted? Could coincidence explain the timing? Bongino answered each question carefully, acknowledging uncertainty while explaining why investigators found some explanations less persuasive than others. It was not a courtroom, but it felt close. When Omar was finally given the chance to speak, the room seemed to lean forward. She described the investigation as politically motivated, rooted in bias, and reflective of a broader pattern she had faced throughout her career. She questioned the role of foreign intelligence in initiating concerns. She suggested that criticism of U.S. foreign policy was being conflated with disloyalty. Her words were familiar, powerful, and, to her supporters, convincing. But the response was not what she expected. Instead of rebutting her rhetoric, committee members returned to specifics: dates, documents, discrepancies. They asked her to clarify, to contextualize, to explain in concrete terms. When pressed on certain points, she hesitated. When pressed further, she declined to answer. The invocation of the Fifth Amendment changed the atmosphere instantly. Legally, it was her right. Politically, it was devastating. In Washington, silence often speaks louder than denial. Commentators would later debate what it meant, but inside that room, the implications were obvious. The narrative was slipping out of her control. By the time the session ended, no formal conclusions had been announced publicly. There were no handcuffs, no cameras, no dramatic exits. What there was instead was a quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted. Trust, once questioned, is rarely restored easily, and questions, once raised, have a way of multiplying. In the days that followed, fragments of the story began to leak, not details, but contours. Words like counterintelligence, classified review, and referral appeared in cautious headlines. Members of Congress offered carefully worded statements that neither condemned nor defended. Some urged patience, others transparency. Few sounded confident. Supporters of Omar framed the situation as another attempt to silence a dissenting voice. Critics argued that no one, regardless of ideology, should be above scrutiny. The public was left to navigate between narratives, each incomplete, each persuasive in its own way. Was this accountability, or was it persecution dressed up as procedure? And who gets to decide the difference? The broader implications extended beyond any single person. If the allegations, even partially, were true, they raised uncomfortable questions about oversight and access. If they were false, they raised equally troubling questions about how power can be weaponized. Either way, the episode exposed fault lines that had been widening for years. Trust in institutions, already fragile, took another hit. For Omar herself, the future became uncertain in a way it had never been before. Political survival depends not just on innocence, but on perception. Once doubt sets in, even allies hesitate. Silence becomes strategy. Distance becomes defense. And confidence, once effortless, becomes harder to project. Years from now, historians may debate what really happened in that room. They will parse transcripts, compare timelines, and argue about motives. They will ask whether warning signs were missed or whether ambition blinded people to risk. They will question whether the system worked as intended or revealed its own vulnerabilities. They may never agree. What remains undeniable is the lesson Washington relearns over and over. Power invites scrutiny, especially when combined with secrecy. Narratives protect until they don't. And the line between dissent and disloyalty, once blurred, becomes a battlefield all its own. In that sense, the story was never just about Ilhan Omar. It was about how much trust a democracy can afford and how much doubt it can survive. The weeks after that closed-door session did not bring clarity so much as they brought choreography. Statements were issued that said a lot while committing to nothing, the kind of language that sounds responsible until you notice it never answers the actual question. Omar's allies spoke about principles and precedent, about how dissent must be protected, about how suspicion can be manufactured with a few well-placed leaks. Her critics spoke about trust and access, about how classified information is not a vibe or a talking point, and how process exists because people are fallible. Somewhere in the middle sat the public, trying to read meaning into the spaces between words. Inside the Capitol, staffers began treating Omar like a weather system, not because anyone said anything definitive, but because uncertainty makes people cautious in the same way thunder makes you look for a roof. Meetings that used to be casual became scheduled, documented, and conducted with the stiffness of a dentist appointment. Colleagues who used to speak to her in hallways started speaking to her in doorways, as if proximity itself could become a headline. Nobody wanted to be the person caught smiling in the background of the wrong photograph. Omar, for her part, tried to do what seasoned politicians do when the ground shifts under them. She kept showing up, kept voting, kept speaking, kept insisting that the story being told about her was not the story of her life. She emphasized her record, the legislation, the constituent services, the immigrant narrative that had once electrified supporters and unnerved opponents. She reminded people that she had endured years of suspicion and survived, and that survival can start to feel like proof. But survival is not the same as vindication, and anyone who has lived long enough knows the difference. The real problem wasn't that people believed a single claim. The problem was that the claims came wrapped in procedure, and procedure has a credibility all its own. A rumor is easy to mock, a headline is easy to denounce, but a closed-door briefing with bipartisan attendance lands differently. It gives people permission to say, "I don't know," while quietly acting like they do. And in politics, behavior becomes reality faster than evidence ever does. In private, some Democrats began asking each other the kind of questions they never ask out loud. If this is nothing, why are so many people acting like it isn't? If it's everything, why isn't it public yet? If it's somewhere in between, how do you handle that without detonating your own coalition? The squad, once treated as a single brand, began looking more like what it always was: individuals with overlapping interests, not identical incentives. Solidarity is easy when the cost is low, and expensive when it isn't. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, usually quick to frame a controversy in moral terms, sounded unusually cautious. Not because caution is her natural instinct, but because caution is what you do when every sentence you say becomes ammunition for someone else. She spoke about waiting for facts, about due process, about not feeding a story before understanding it. To supporters, it sounded responsible. To critics, it sounded like distancing. To reporters, It sounded like blood in the water. If the loudest defenders aren't defending, everyone assumes they've seen something you haven't. Republicans, meanwhile, behaved like people who had waited years for a moment like this. They didn't all say the same thing, but they moved with the same confidence, like a team that thinks the other side forgot to show up. Some demanded immediate consequences, others demanded transparency, and a few demanded both at once, which is always a neat trick. They framed the entire situation as proof of what they had been saying all along, as if history had finally decided to reward their persistence. And they did it with that familiar tone of moral certainty that makes moderates cringe and base voters cheer. The media, predictably, split into its own tribes. Some outlets treated the story like a cautionary tale about national security and institutional trust. Others treated it like a cautionary tale about how institutions can target the wrong people while claiming they're protecting the right ones. Cable panels stacked guests like chess pieces, always making sure there was a fight, always making sure there was no resolution. Social media turned nuance into a punchline, because nuance is slow and outrage is fast. And the public kept asking the same question in 100 different forms. What do we actually know? A second, quieter question followed close behind. Who benefits from not knowing? Because uncertainty can be weaponized too, not just truth. If you want to weaken someone, you don't always need to prove them wrong. You just need to make people unsure. A cloud of suspicion changes behavior, shifts alliances, dries up donors, scares off endorsements, and invites challengers. Sometimes the cloud is justified, sometimes it isn't, and sometimes it's a mix of both, in proportions no one can measure. Behind the scenes, the intelligence committees began revisiting something most Americans never think about. How much access should elected officials have to raw intelligence? How much should they have to share, even internally? How do you balance oversight of secret programs with the reality that elected officials are, by definition, political animals? If oversight is toothless, agencies run wild. If oversight is porous, secrets bleed out. It's a design problem disguised as a morality play. Some members floated new internal rules, not as punishment, but as modernization. More tracking of who attends which briefings, more compartmentalization, more mandatory refreshers, more signatures, more audits. To the average person, it would sound like bureaucratic clutter. But bureaucratic clutter is often how institutions express fear. When trust erodes, paperwork grows. And when paperwork grows, power quietly shifts toward the people who control the paperwork. Omar's team tried to counter with their own strategy, one they had used before. Frame the controversy as a political pattern, a familiar cycle of suspicion aimed at a specific kind of target. Highlight the way accusations can become self-fulfilling when repeated often enough. Remind supporters that some of the loudest critics had never accepted her legitimacy in the first place. In other words, turn the story back into a referendum on bias rather than an argument about details. It was a strategy that had worked before, and that was the temptation. But something about this moment resisted the usual script. The claims weren't coming from talk radio or partisan blogs, at least not initially. They were coming from people in suits speaking in conditional verbs, from offices that rarely speak in public at all. And that forced even sympathetic observers to pause, because bias is easy to spot when it's loud, but harder when it's quiet. The quiet version still can be biased, but it doesn't advertise itself. Then came the slow drip of sources familiar with the matter, that magical phrase that can mean anything and still get printed. A few details appeared, never enough to confirm, always enough to inflame. Dates, meetings, references to briefings, references to communications, references to money without full context. Each fragment landed like a stone thrown into a pond, and the ripples collided until the water looked like chaos. Every new fragment produced 2 new theories, and every theory produced 5 new accusations, which is how the internet works. At this point, the story stopped being about what happened in a secure room and started being about what people imagined happened. Some imagined a righteous investigation that exposed a genuine threat. Some imagined a sophisticated smear dressed up in official language. Some imagined a mess of misunderstandings, opportunism, and bureaucratic momentum that no one could easily stop once it started. And some imagined all of the above at once, because contradictions are a kind of comfort now. If everything is possible, then nothing has to be faced. Bongino stayed out of the spotlight, which only amplified his presence. He didn't do interviews, didn't post triumphant statements, didn't taunt. He spoke through formal channels and let others fill the silence with their own interpretations. To supporters, that restraint looked like professionalism. To critics, it looked like calculation. To everyone, it looked like a person who believed the process would speak for him. A few members of Congress began privately complaining about the situation in a way that revealed their real fear. Not fear of Omar specifically, but fear of precedent. If an investigation can surround a member of Congress with suspicion using classified materials the public cannot see, what does that do to democratic accountability? But if credible concerns exist and Congress shrugs because the optics are awkward, what does that do to national security? It's the kind of dilemma where every option comes with a cost, and pretending otherwise is just marketing. And Washington is very good at marketing. In Minnesota, Omar's district became a mirror for the national fracture. Supporters organized around her as a symbol, insisting she was being targeted for her identity and her politics. Critics organized around her as a warning, insisting she was proof the system had been too permissive. Neighbors who agreed on potholes and school funding suddenly found themselves arguing about loyalty and legitimacy like they were cable pundits. Everyone acted like they were defending something larger than a single politician. That's how you know a story has escaped its original boundaries. There was also the human dimension, the part most commentary avoids because it complicates the narrative. Omar had children, colleagues, staffers who depended on their paychecks, supporters who saw themselves reflected in her career. She also had opponents who had spent years watching her rise and feeling, fairly or unfairly, like she represented something they couldn't control. When a figure becomes symbolic, people stop seeing them as a person and start seeing them as a screen. They project hopes and fears onto that screen until the actual individual almost doesn't matter. Politics is often just projection with better lighting. As more time passed without public resolution, the story developed a second life. It became a test of patience. And patience is not a common American virtue. People began demanding outcomes they could feel: resignation, exoneration, charges, apologies, hearings, speeches, anything that could close the loop. But national security matters, by their nature, resist tidy closure. They move slowly, behind doors, within rules that are designed to protect information rather than satisfy curiosity. That's not comforting, but it's real. Some members started talking about reforms that sounded simple until you tried to implement them. Should members of Congress be required to undergo more stringent security procedures? Should there be clearer rules around travel and foreign contacts? Should access be tiered based on role? Should violations, if proven, carry automatic consequences? Each question sounded reasonable until you remembered that Congress writes the rules for itself, and self-regulation is famously imperfect. By late winter, The atmosphere in Washington had shifted from shock to grim anticipation. Not everyone expected the same outcome, but everyone expected something. The committees prepared for more closed sessions. Party leadership prepared statements they hoped they would never have to deliver. Donors began hedging, because donors hedge the way gamblers hedge, always seeking a way to win no matter what happens. And Omar's office operated like a place under siege, even if no one said the word. If you want to understand how power works, watch what people do when the script breaks. Watch who calls whom, who avoids whom, who suddenly has to check their schedule. Watch which colleagues stop returning texts. Watch which allies become philosophical, which is Washington's polite way of becoming non-committal. And watch how quickly certainty becomes a liability when new information might arrive tomorrow. The moment you say never, tomorrow shows up with a receipt. Omar still went on television, still spoke at events, still insisted that the story being told about her was not the truth. She framed it as retaliation for outspoken criticism of U.S. foreign policy. She questioned why certain foreign sources were treated as credible when they aligned with a particular agenda. She emphasized that disagreement is not disloyalty, and that political speech should not be policed through insinuation. All of that sounded plausible to many people, because many people have watched insinuation weaponized before. The difficulty was that plausibility doesn't settle anything, and that was the tension that held the entire country in place like a clenched fist. If the claims were baseless, the damage to faith in institutions would be severe. If the claims were partially true, the damage to faith in elected officials would be severe. If the claims were complex, tangled in interpretation and context, the damage would be spread out, diluted, and therefore harder to repair. It wasn't just a political story anymore. It was a stress test. And the stress test didn't come with a timer. The longer the story dragged on, the more it invited a particular kind of American suspicion. Not the suspiciousness of conspiracy, but the suspiciousness of people who have been lied to enough times to stop trusting simple explanations. People began asking whether this was about policy fights, about faction wars inside agencies, about rivalries between committees, about something personal, or about something none of them could name. They asked whether certain people were leaking to shape the outcome. They asked whether silence was proof or strategy. They asked, in essence, whether anyone was telling them the whole truth. And here's the part that made the whole situation combustible. In a country built on open debate, secrecy creates a vacuum. In that vacuum, imagination rushes in like air, and imagination rarely arrives alone. It brings anger, certainty, and a story that flatters whoever is telling it. One side imagines a noble hunt for a hidden threat. The other imagines a cynical effort to destroy a political enemy. Both sides imagine themselves as the heroes, because that's how people cope. When the next closed-door briefing was scheduled, it didn't feel like routine. It felt like the system bracing for impact. Staff began whispering again. Reporters began camping near committee doors with that patient predator, calm. Leaders began rehearsing the kind of statements that sound human while staying legally safe. And the country waited, not for a verdict, but for a signal that the waiting itself would end. Because at some point, every political storm reaches the same crossroads. Either the process produces public facts that reorganize reality, or it produces more secrecy that deepens the divide. Either the person at the center survives and claims vindication, or they don't, and the story becomes a cautionary tale. Either the institutions look credible, or they look like weapons. In this case, the stakes were so high that even the people who thought they knew what was coming seemed reluctant to say it out loud. And reluctance, in Washington, is often the closest thing to honesty you'll ever get. Eventually, the story stopped expanding and started settling. Not because answers arrived, but because exhaustion did. Audiences don't stay suspended forever, and even uncertainty has a half-life. New controversies pushed their way into the headlines, as they always do, demanding attention with the urgency of something louder and easier to explain. But this one didn't disappear so much as it receded, lingering in the background like a question no one felt comfortable asking again. In Washington, unresolved questions don't vanish. They wait. For Omar, that waiting became its own reality. Every appearance, every vote, every statement was filtered through a lens she didn't control. Supporters listened for defiance, critics listened for slips, and everyone else listened for fatigue. She insisted, repeatedly, that history would judge the situation differently than the present moment. That's a common belief among people under scrutiny, and sometimes it even turns out to be true. Inside institutions, quiet adjustments continued without fanfare. Procedures were tightened, briefings became narrower, and access was granted with more hesitation than before. No one called it punishment, and no one called it reform. It was simply described as prudence, a word that often appears when trust has been strained but not officially broken. The machinery of government rarely announces its emotions, but it expresses them through rules. For observers, the episode became a kind of Rorschach test. Those inclined to distrust power saw confirmation of their fears about secretive processes and selective scrutiny. Those inclined to prioritize security saw confirmation of their fears about access without sufficient safeguards. And a large portion of the public saw something more unsettling. A system that could generate enormous consequences without ever offering a clear narrative ordinary people could evaluate for themselves. That discomfort lingered longer than outrage ever does. In time, the conversation shifted from this specific case to the broader dilemma it exposed. How much transparency can exist in a system built to protect secrets? How much trust should be extended to individuals operating inside that system? And how quickly suspicion, once introduced, can reshape political reality regardless of final outcomes? These questions didn't have partisan answers, which made them harder to monetize and easier to ignore. Years from now, the details may still be debated in academic papers, memoirs, and footnotes. People will argue about motives, about interpretation, about whether the warning signs were obvious or exaggerated. They will quote transcripts selectively, emphasize certain timelines, dismiss others, and build narratives that say more about their worldview than about the event itself. That's how political memory works in America. It doesn't preserve facts so much as it preserves arguments. What remains is a quieter lesson, one that doesn't trend well but tends to endure. Power magnifies everything, including ambiguity. When questions involve secrecy, trust becomes fragile even in the absence of proof. And when institutions speak softly while acting decisively, people fill the silence with whatever story makes the most sense to them. In the end, the damage, or the vindication, often comes not from what is proven, but from what can no longer be unheard.